August 12th, 1961. Lower Wacker Drive, Chicago. An officer on the early morning patrol noticed a car sitting abandoned in the underground stretch of road that tunnels beneath the city's surface streets. He walked over, looked through the window. The smell reached him before he even touched the door handle. He opened the trunk. Inside was the almost unrecognizable remains of a man, almost naked. Rope burns ground so deep into his wrists and ankles that bone was visible through the tissue. Burns across his chest and arms from a blowtorch. A hole punched through his right ear from something sharp. And evidence of damage so systematic, so prolonged, and so deliberate that the medical examiner's findings would later be referenced in FBI briefings, Senate testimony, and organized crime literature for the next 60 years. The man in that trunk was William Jackson, 40 years old. Born December 13th, 1920, right there in Chicago, on the same South Side streets where he would later work and where he would ultimately die. He stood over 6 feet tall and weighed more than 300 pounds. The streets knew him as Action. Chicago police described him in official records as a man with the body of a giant and the brain of a child. That description wasn't cruelty. It was an assessment. He was a juice collector for the Chicago outfit. He was the man who appeared at your door when you hadn't made your payment on a loan shark debt. He didn't negotiate. He didn't reason with you. He arrived, and the problem resolved itself. This is the story of how that man, 300 pounds of muscle and loyalty, who had never once broken the outfit's code, died for a crime he did not commit. This is the story of what happens when paranoia takes root inside an organization that has no courts, no appeals, no mechanism for the truth to reach the people making the decisions. And this is the story of what 72 hours of documented torture proved in the end. Nothing. Because there was nothing to prove. William Action Jackson was not an informant. He died knowing it. His killers finished it, still not believing it. But here is what history has never fully reckoned with. The Chicago outfit was one of the most surveillance-conscious criminal organizations in America. They swept rooms for microphones. They rotated meeting locations. They communicated in code and conducted sensitive conversations on the street, in moving cars, and in back rooms they trusted personally. So how did the precise details of what happened to Action Jackson reach the FBI within days of his death? That answer does not make anyone look good. Not the mob, not the federal government, and maybe not anyone in the space between them. You have to understand what Chicago was in 1953, the year William Jackson came home from prison. He had served his time on a robbery conviction handed down in 1949, 4 to 8 years. Before that, a rape charge in 1947 that never resulted in conviction. Before that, his first arrest in 1941 up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, assault and robbery when he was 20 years old. By the time he walked back into Chicago in '53, he already had the resume the outfit looked for in muscle. He had done time. He had not talked. He was physical. And he needed work. The city he returned to was still running on the architecture of the Capone era, just updated, restructured, and professional, in ways that Capone himself would barely have recognized. Every neighborhood had a crew. Every crew answered upward through a chain of underbosses and capos to whoever was running the organization that year. The outfit was not like the New York families. It was leaner, more compartmentalized. And in 1953, it was quietly consolidating power in ways that would make it one of the most feared criminal enterprises in the country through the entire decade that followed. Jackson found his place in the loan sharking operation. The outfit's juice business was not casual street lending. It was a structured financial system. The interest rates ran anywhere from 10 to 20% per week, not per year, per week. If you borrowed $5,000 from an outfit loan shark, you owed $500 a week just in interest before you'd touch the principal. Miss a payment, and the juice doubled. Miss two, and a collector showed up. That collector, in the territory Jackson worked, was often Jackson himself. Here's the thing about being a juice collector. The job had nothing to do with violence most of the time. It had to do with presence. A man who weighs over 300 pounds, who walks into your shop and just looks at you, has already made his argument. Jackson was good at this. He was reliable in a business that required reliability above everything else. And through the late 1950s, he became closely aligned with the operation of a man named Samuel DeStefano. Mad Sam DeStefano, remember that name. Born September 13th, 1909. A loan shark, a killer, and by the assessment of FBI agents who spent decades tracking Chicago organized crime, one of the most sadistic criminal operators in American history. Agent William F. Romer, who ran the FBI's Chicago Organized Crime Squad, described DeStefano as the worst torture murderer in the history of the United States. That is not hyperbole. That is what the man's file said. DeStefano had a soundproof chamber in the basement of his home where he conducted business with debtors who had fallen behind on payments. He would foam at the mouth during interrogations. FBI agents who surveilled him documented behavior so erratic and so extreme that even the outfit's bosses, men who had ordered dozens of murders between them, found DeStefano difficult to manage. He was useful. He was productive. He ran his juice operation with savage efficiency. But he was also a liability, and everyone above him knew it. Jackson worked within DeStefano's network through the late 1950s and into 1960. He was collecting. He was effective. He had never given the outfit any reason to look sideways at him. And then 1961 arrived. And two things happened in close sequence that together would cost him his life. The first was the warehouse arrest. Jackson was picked up along with 5 other men while they were unloading a stolen truck at a warehouse on Chicago's South Side. The cargo was $70,000 worth of electrical appliances. When the other 5 men saw the agents and ran, Jackson stood still. He simply could not move fast enough to get away. He was taken into custody and processed, and during that processing, FBI agents confirmed something they had already suspected. Jackson was a juice collector for Sam DeStefano. He had direct, documented connections to the outfit's loan sharking operations. He was in serious legal trouble. He was, by every calculation federal investigators used, a candidate for cooperation. The second thing that happened was Bill Romer. In 1960, a year before the warehouse arrest, Romer, one of the architects of the FBI's modern informant program in Chicago, had already approached Jackson directly. He sat down with him and asked him to become an informant for the federal government. Jackson said no. No hesitation, no negotiation, no apparent consideration of the offer at all. He refused, and that was the end of the conversation. Here's where it gets complicated. Because within the outfit, what mattered was not what Jackson said to Romer. What mattered was that the conversation had taken place at all. The FBI had approached him. He had been arrested at a warehouse. He had been in federal custody. He had been photographed meeting with law enforcement. In a world where suspicion and paranoia are survival mechanisms, those facts assembled themselves into a story that had nothing to do with reality. Sam Giancana was running the Chicago outfit in 1961. He had taken over as boss in 1957 and would hold that position until 1966. Giancana was smart, politically connected at levels that extended well outside organized crime, and obsessively cautious about law enforcement. Under his watch, the outfit operated with discipline about who talked, who met with whom, and who was exposed to federal scrutiny. Any member of the organization whose movements brought him into visible proximity with the government was, by definition, a problem. The exact conversation that condemned Jackson has never been fully reconstructed. Accounts vary on this. What is documented is that the decision was made at a level above DeStefano, above the street operation, and that by early August of 1961, Jackson was not going to survive the month. There is one other theory on record, and it deserves to be mentioned. Author Gus Russo, in his book The Outfit, writes that some insiders believed Jackson's killing was not about informing at all. They believed he had raped the wife of an imprisoned, mob-connected man, and that the charge of being an informant was applied after the decision to kill him had already been made. That version has never been confirmed. What is confirmed is that the charges leveled against Jackson, whatever they were in their full form, produced a response that was not an execution. It was something else entirely. Sometime in early August of 1961, William Jackson was picked up. The accounts of exactly how he was taken vary in their details. What is known is where he ended up. A meat-rendering plant on Chicago's South Side. A working facility. The kind of place built around the organized disassembly of large animals, where the equipment in place, the hooks, the rails, the tools designed for heavy physical work, was already there and ready. Among the men present that night were David Yaris, a known hitman, Jackie Cerrone, who would one day become boss of the Chicago outfit, Fiore Buccieri, one of the most feared enforcers in the organization, and James Torello, a killer whose subsequent comments about what happened in that building were later captured by a federal surveillance device and became part of the documented record of this case. Jackson was stripped. His wrists and ankles were bound with rope, and then he was impaled through his rectum on a meat hook and lifted into the air. What James Torello later said about it was captured on tape. These are his documented words. Jackson was hung up on that meat hook. He was there for 2 or 3 days. He was so heavy, he bent the hook. He was still alive. Every once in a while, he'd come to and scream. Then he'd pass out again. Over the course of those 72 hours, the medical examiner's findings and FBI documentation record what was done to him. His kneecaps were shattered with a baseball bat. His ribs were broken. He was shot. He was stabbed and cut with sharp objects. A cattle prod was used on his body. Sections of his chest and arms were burned with a blowtorch. Something sharp was driven through his right ear. He lost consciousness. He regained consciousness. And every time awareness returned, he was asked the same question. And every time, he gave the same answer. He was not an informant. He had nothing to confess. He had not talked to anyone because he had nothing to tell anyone. They did not believe him. Or the decision had already passed beyond the point where his answer could matter. By the time 3 days had passed, William Jackson was gone. He died in that building on Chicago's South Side, 40 years old, from the accumulated trauma of what had been done to him over 3 days. On August 12, 1961, his body was found crammed into the trunk of his own car on Lower Wacker Drive, almost naked. The rope marks on his wrists were deep into the tissue. The blowtorch burns had charred sections of his skin into something that the first officer on the scene later said he could not find words for in his report. The wound in his right ear was still visible. 300 pounds of a man who had never once informed on anyone, dead in the city where he was born. Now here is the irony that cuts deepest. The outfit was right to be afraid of informants. They had been penetrated. They had microphones in places they didn't know about. The FBI was developing real sources inside the organization at exactly that time. But William Jackson was not one of them. He was, in every verifiable sense, exactly what he always said he was. A loyal member of the organization who had turned down the FBI's approach and never looked back. The wife of Murray Humphreys, one of the outfit's most powerful fixers, later claimed that the conversation where the FBI's surveillance device captured the details of what happened to Jackson was staged. That the men involved knew the room was wired, and that the account of the torture was delivered into that microphone deliberately, not as a confession, as a broadcast, a warning directed at every other member of the organization who was weighing their options. If that is true, then Jackson did not just die for nothing. He died so that his death could serve as a message. His body, his 3 days of unanswered agony, his refusal to confess to something he hadn't done, was turned into a demonstration of what the cost of disloyalty looked like. Whether he was guilty or not became irrelevant. The performance was the point. The men who were in that building went on with their careers. Jackie Cerrone climbed through the outfit's structure and eventually became boss. Fiore Buccieri died of natural causes in 1973. David Yaris remained operational for years. James Torello continued in organized crime until his death. Sam DiStefano, the man Jackson had worked under, survived 12 more years. His erratic behavior grew more extreme. His courtroom antics during trial appearances became spectacles. By 1973, his unpredictability had become a genuine threat to the people above him. On April 14th of that year, Tony Spilotro met DiStefano in the garage at the 1600 block of North Sayre Avenue in Chicago's Galewood neighborhood. Spilotro fired twice with a shotgun. Mad Sam DiStefano died in that garage. He was 63 years old. The case of William Action Jackson was entered into the congressional record during Senate hearings on organized crime. It was cited in federal reports on the Chicago outfit's methods of internal enforcement. It appeared in academic and journalistic work on organized crime for decades after, and it was used as supporting evidence in the legislative arguments that eventually expanded the government's authority to pursue organized crime through wiretapping, surveillance, and the organized tools that would later produce the RICO statute. What this case teaches goes beyond one man's death. The Chicago outfit was an organization that operated on the logic of fear, not evidence. It could not afford a justice system because a justice system requires the possibility of innocence. The outfit's internal discipline required no such possibility. Suspicion was enough. Proximity to law enforcement was enough. And once a decision was made, the truth of the matter was not a relevant factor. William Jackson never talked. He never cooperated. He never gave the FBI or anyone else a single piece of information about the organization that employed him. And then that organization tortured him for 3 days and killed him for crimes that existed only in its own paranoid calculations. That is what loyalty buys you in the mob. Not protection, not gratitude, not safety. You get used for as long as you're useful, and the moment a doubt surfaces, however unfounded, however unjust, you become a problem, and the outfit was very efficient at solving problems. If this story shook you, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every single week. Drop a comment below and tell us what story we should cover next. We read every one.